ISIS a lifeline. Despite this new, deeply concerning information, we still don't have a plan from the President on how he'll ensure the enduring defeat of ISIS. Instead, the President continues to demonstrate an uncanny ability to get steamrolled by autocrats like Erdogan and Putin without getting anything in return. This is the President's own, this is our own Defense Department, the DIA, impartial, that is saying that ISIS's position was improved after President Trump gave in to Erdogan and let them come in and take the place of the Kurds in Turkey. So we say to Donald Trump, Mr. President, where is your plan to defeat ISIS and protect the United States? What are you going to do in response to the Defense Intelligence Agency, an agency you oversee as president, saying that ISIS has been strengthened by your actions? Now, a lot of my Republican colleagues, our Republican colleagues, are feeling the heat about McConnell's legislative graveyard in the do-nothing Senate. They've decided to focus on nominees, and now they're looking for somebody to blame for their choices. The Republican membership should take their complaints to Leader McConnell. This week, last week, the week before, not a single vote on legislation. If we were in charge of the floor, we'd be voting on a whole lot of legislation, a lot of the bills the House kept put through. If legislation is so important, these Republicans can go to Leader McConnell and say, put something on the floor. He's the one who has the sole power to do this, instead of debating more radical judges who take women's rights away, which is all we've been doing. It's hard to take President Trump and Senate Republicans seriously, and they try to blame the House impeachment inquiry for legislative inaction. We haven't debated impeachment on the floor of the Senate. We could be debating legislation. Leader McConnell is blocking it, and every Republican member is going along, because I don't see them going to the floor and asking that legislation be brought up and debated. This is so typical of our Republican friends. And listen to this one. Look how galling this one is. 3 years into the Trump administration, the most glaring failure is President Trump's refusal to work with Democrats on an infrastructure package. He said right from the get-go he wants to do a big infrastructure package. Then he walked out of a meeting on infrastructure with Speaker Pelosi and me. He hasn't put a thing on the floor, and now he has commercials out there blaming Democrats for no infrastructure bill. What kind of inside-out Alice in Wonderland logic is this? And again, the House passed more than 300 pieces of legislation. They're languishing in Leader McConnell's legislative graveyard. He and the vulnerable Republicans are feeling the heat, but they don't know what to do about it. They're too afraid to buck Trump and buck McConnell. The Dream and Promise Act, which Dick Durbin has such an interest in, 168 days ago was passed. The bipartisan background check, 265 days. The American people know who to blame for the inaction. Leader McConnell, President Trump. Senator Durbin.
A Senate is a terrible thing to waste, and we are wasting the United States Senate now. Do you know how many amendments have been voted on the floor of the United States Senate in the calendar year we're currently in? 21. 21 amendments in the entire year. And Leader McConnell comes out here and says the reason we're not doing anything is the impeachment inquiry in the House. How do you explain the first 10 months of the year, Majority Leader? 21 amendments during that period of time? That reflects the fact that we're not taking up legislation on the floor of the United States Senate. Obviously, Leader McConnell thinks there's really nothing to address, nothing that needs debating. Well, I think he's overlooking the obvious. We have a desperate need in this country to deal with the escalating price of prescription drugs across the United States. What bill is coming to the floor? None. We have a unanimous consent request from a Republican senator to bring a matter to the floor. I'd like to send a note to the senator from Texas and tell him you should speak to your majority leader. He sets the agenda on the floor, And we ought to be bringing up a bill that both Democrats and Republicans can debate on bringing down the cost of prescription drugs. Chuck mentioned the Promise and Dream Act. I went to that Supreme Court hearing just the other day, a hearing that will decide the fate of 790,000 people in the United States. Now we'll wait until next June to see if the Supreme Court rules and how they rule. In the meantime, what is the Senate going to do? What if we considered the bill passed by the House, the Promise and Dream Act, which would address this issue on a legislative basis and do it quickly so that their fate could be determined, and I hope in a positive way? It's an obvious indication that Leader McConnell, because of President Trump or whatever reason, has no interest in legislating. I'd say this to Senator McConnell: if you don't want to use the United States Senate, please give it to someone who will. Perhaps maybe give it to a few Democrats. We've got a few ideas.
Senator Murray.
Well, thank you so much. You know, since the beginning of this Congress in January, Leader McConnell and the Senate Republicans have worked aggressively to halt the regular legislative process and turn this Senate into a legislative graveyard, refusing to allow this body to do its job, to vote on laws that protect and serve the families and communities that we represent. So as we hear Republican leaders begin to blame the House impeachment inquiry for how little the Senate is getting done, I have to wonder, what stopped Leader McConnell from calling up bipartisan legislation to secure our elections from foreign interference that passed the House in March? What stopped Leader McConnell from bringing up bipartisan legislation passed by the House in May to address the climate crisis and stop President Trump from leaving the Paris Climate Agreement? What stopped Leader McConnell this fall from allowing the Senate to vote on legislation to stop the Trump administration from making it easier for insurers to threaten critical protections for patients with pre-existing conditions? And after devastating back-to-back mass shootings in Texas and Ohio in August, what prevented Leader McConnell from taking up universal background check legislation or any common sense gun safety reforms to finally address the gun violence issue that has cost too many lives? The fact is, the Senate has stopped legislating for one reason: because the majority leader would rather rubber stamp President Trump's agenda than get anything done for our families and our communities. Senate Republicans can try to pass the blame anywhere they want, from the House impeachment inquiry to the weather, but their argument doesn't pass muster, not even close. And if they don't like it, when their inaction is pointed out, it's very clear what they can do. They can join Democrats and get to work on the long list of challenges we can and should be making progress on, from health care to gun violence to the climate crisis and more. We are ready to get to work. We have been ready to get to work from day one, and we're not going to stop pushing Senate Republican leaders to start getting things done here.
Senator Casey.
Thanks very much. I want to amplify what was referenced earlier in terms of the number of days in the legislative graveyard. Nothing has happened with regard to gun violence. We were told after the horrors of just this past summer that there would be action. The majority leader talked about considering a background check bill and an extreme risk protection order bill. Of course, neither has happened. Just in terms of the H.R. 8, the Universal Background Check Bill, 265 days in the legislative graveyard. We know that as a nation, we lose 100 people every day to gun violence. You would think in the face of that, we would at least, at a bare minimum, you would get a vote on a universal background check bill. No one would argue that that's going to be enough, but that would be a good start, but we haven't even had that. I can just recite some numbers, and unfortunately these numbers are the ages of people just in Philadelphia just the last couple of weeks. And I will only reference an age of someone who was actually killed. Starting in late October, just until recently, a 6-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 19-year-old. It goes on and on and on. And back in Pennsylvania, when I travel across our state, everywhere you go, people ask us, when are you going to vote on at least one measure, one common sense gun measure? People ask that all over the state. And I have to keep telling them over and over again, it's up to one person. One person can decide, and that person is the majority leader. He's chosen not to bring these bills to the floor, and I think the American people are losing patience with that. In addition to communities like Philadelphia, which have seemingly daily or at least weekly instances of violence, we had the most recent in Santa Clarita in California, 2 killed, 3 wounded. A story out of New Jersey, Pleasantville, at a football game, a 10-year-old, now apparently in a coma from that. We have children who are required to go through active shooter drills, and even this year, the advent of children going to school with backpacks that are up-armored, in a sense, because of gun violence. If we're demanding or pushing families to take those steps and schools to take those steps, the least that the United States Senate could do is pull one bill at least out of the graveyard and vote on universal background checks.
Okay. Questions? Burgess.
Senator Ernst said earlier today that you don't want to pass a Violence Against Women Act reauthorization because she's a
Well, we have tried to pass the Violence Against Women Act many times. Patty Murray has asked unanimous consents on it, and the House passed it over 200 days ago. Senator Ernst is simply afraid of the NRA. Ask Senator Ernst if she believes that a boyfriend of a woman who has gotten a protection order issued against him should get a gun. Senator Ernst evidently believes yes, because in the bill she's putting forward, it doesn't have that provision, even though it did in the House. So if Senator Ernst wants to debate VAWA, let her ask Leader McConnell, make a unanimous consent request to bring the House-passed bill on the floor, and we'll debate it. And we can debate her amendment, which the gun lobby wants, but almost no other American wants.
some speculation about the president's.
And by the way, she just introduced it today, so she's a bit, no pun intended, jumping the gun.
There's been some speculation about the president's trip to Walter Reed over the weekend. The White House issued a statement last night and came down on that. Do you have any concerns about this trip?
Well, look, I don't have any idea what's going on, but if we learned anything at all from this administration, it takes them several tries before they get their story straight and the truth comes out. So I think people are right to question the truthfulness of stories from the administration. In the meantime, I wish the president well from whatever he's recovering from and whatever caused him to go to the hospital in the first place.
I was going to ask if you
We'll do both of you.
Thank you. Do you have any concerns that a lengthy impeachment trial in the Senate will make it hard for members of your conference or your caucus to effectively run for president?
Well, the bottom line is impeachment is one of the most solemn responsibilities that the Constitution gives the Senate, to have a trial after the impeachment of a president should it occur in the House. And we're not going to let scheduling requests get in the way of that solemn responsibility, period.
Are appropriations to the NDAA VAWA bill viable vehicles for all legislation that aren't getting individual votes on the floor?
Well, look, the bottom line is we'd like to have individual votes on the floor. There should be a full debate, like on the VAWA bill. Should a boyfriend who has a protection order issued against him be able to get a gun? Should a woman on an Indian reservation get similar protections to other women? Those are important issues to be debated, so it's much better to debate these fully on the floor. Up to now, McConnell and the Republican leadership has not let that happen. Last one.
On health care, do you support the surprise medical billing legislation that came out of the Health Committee? I mean, I understand that New York hospitals have some concerns with that.
Look, I think we have to do something about surprise billing, and there are two different proposals, and I think the leadership is working that out. Okay? Thank you, everybody.